Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's webcast. I'm Chris O'Flaherty with Oculus, and I'm here tonight with Dr. Barry Eiden and Dr. William Tullo from the International Keratoconus Academy of Eye Care Practitioners. Before we get started, I would like to point out that you have a text box on the right side of your screen for typing in questions. I encourage you to ask questions during the presentation, and there should be some time at the end for Q&A. Tonight is part 2 of a 3-part webcast series. If you've registered for this webinar, then you are automatically registered for all 3. Part 3 of the series will be held next Wednesday, September 7th at the same time as tonight's webinar. And I will make sure to display all of this information on the screen at the end of the presentation. On behalf of Oculus, I'd like to thank the International Keratoconus Academy for everything they've done to make this event possible. And special thanks to all of the speakers, Dr. Andrew Morgenstern, Dr. William Tullo, Dr. Barry Eiden, and speaking next week, Dr. Clark Chang. These guys have been very generous with their time and their efforts, and we really can't thank you guys enough. So without further delay, I will give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Barry Eiden.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody, and it's nice to speak to you again. As a representation of the International Keratoconus Academy, we do welcome you back to part 2 of our 3-part webinar. I'm going to just do a little intro and then pass it over to Bill in a couple of minutes. Basically, tonight we're going to talk about technology and how important technology is in the early diagnosis of keratoconus. We're going to cover topics related to Placido topography, corneal Scheimpflug tomography, via Pentacam. We'll talk about the role that anterior segment OCT plays today and will be playing in the future, a little bit about high-resolution ultrasonography, aberrometry, and a really exciting topic that we'll talk about later on this evening, and that is the biomechanical properties of the cornea and how we can now measure them and how that applies to keratoconus. So just our disclosure slides for myself and for Dr. Tullo before we get going. And then I just would like to, again, thank everybody for attending and reminding them about our organization, the International Keratoconus Academy of Eye Care Professionals. And it's an organization that has been put in place basically to do things like we're doing tonight, and that is to share information, to help educate, and to help move the needle forward in terms of our ability to make early diagnosis, and therefore with technologies that we have both diagnostically and therapeutically to hopefully preserve and save vision. So for those of you who haven't already joined up with membership, at this point it is complimentary. So if you'll just visit our website at www.keratoconusacademy.com, there's a section there that states subscribe, and if you go there, there will be a coupon code, and that'll allow you to get the complimentary annual membership, and you become part of our group. We share information on email listservs. We put information on our website that you can access and you can actually contribute to, and we also have a Facebook page at the International Keratoconus Academy of Eye Care Professionals. So I do welcome you all, and those who haven't joined yet, please visit the website and join up. It usually takes about 24 to 48 hours to get approval through, so don't be surprised if it takes a day or two. Hopefully we try to do it as quickly as we can. I do want to thank the supporters, the industry supporters of IKA, and topping that list surely tonight is Oculus. They have been absolutely amazing in supporting our efforts, and we really have the same goal as we mentioned, the early diagnosis and the preservation of vision. So thank you to all of our industry sponsors, and we hope that that list is going to increase over time. So we're going to start off tonight. I'll be having Dr. Tullo take over in just a moment. He is going to go over some of the basic concepts related to corneal topography and the interpretation and understanding of Scheimpflug elevation-based corneal tomography. I will then take over afterwards and talk about the application specifically to keratoconus as it relates to some of these other technologies as well. So at this time, I'd like to pass the baton over to Bill, and he will really give us a lot of great information. So thank you, and I'll speak to you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Barry. I appreciate it very much, and thank you, Chris and Oculus, for all you do to help us get this information out. So tonight we're going to spend some time talking about different ways to detect keratoconus and trying to detect them obviously as early as possible to provide our patients the best care possible. We're going to start with a simple concept that's important to remember, and really remembering that our goal is to detect the patients who not only have the disease but who are going to get the disease. We know that all patients who develop keratoconus at some point in their life start out as normal appearing eyes, and these patients will not be detected by topography or tomography. And again, our tools are only as good as the stage of the disease is in. So currently, again, corneal topography and corneal tomography can only detect keratoconus once it's begun. So keep in mind there's always a possibility that you're looking at a patient sitting in your chair where the maps are normal, yet it's just because the disease has not begun yet, particularly when you're looking at a very young patient. We're going to talk about the concept that corneal tomography or elevation maps can detect keratoconus often very much earlier in the disease process. We're also going to talk about, Barry's going to have some exciting slides about the biomechanical changes, and there's some great work by Cynthia Roberts and John Marshall showing that the biomechanical changes may occur even well before any topographic or tomographic changes. So lots of fun, interesting information, but we're going to start off tonight with the basics. And the basics to me is where it all began, and it's Placido disc topography. Remember what Placido disc topography really is. It's really technically not measuring the cornea, it's measuring the tear film. It's a reflection of a light or concentric circles of light off the cornea, which acts like a convex mirror, and is typically off the tear film. And that's an important distinction because you need to have a good intact tear film to get a good Placido disc image to measure. And it doesn't measure curvature directly. It derives curvature from the measurement of slope between the concentric circles. And that's also an important distinction we'll talk more about in a few moments. We're going to talk a little bit about the different maps that you can produce with a Placido disc topographer. Placido disc topographers are by far the most common topographers out there, especially in optometric offices, because the cost of these machines are much less than some of the elevation machines we're going to talk about a little bit later. With the Placido topographers, we can produce all kinds of maps, curvature maps, elevation maps that are calculated, not measured directly, but calculated. We can do difference maps and trend with time maps. But the ones that you are most familiar with and the ones that you see in most studies are the classical axial sagittal maps. And we're going to talk mostly about those to start off with. It's important to keep in mind with Placido disc topography, there are some basic assumptions made. And one of the assumptions made is that the line of sight lines up with the patient's visual axis. And we know with a lot of patients that's often not the case. It could be represented by an angle kappa or an angle lambda, depending on how you describe it. But nevertheless, one of the weaknesses of all Placido disc systems is that the optical axis of the eye often does not line up with the line of sight. And that results in sometimes some distortions of topographies that may make an eye look pathologic when it really isn't. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to tell the difference. So the most common map that we do see is called the axial or sagittal map, and it's described by a measurement of radius of curvature. And it's a reference distance, not really a true curvature. And one of the big weaknesses of these maps is it's purely based on a spherical calculation. So the normal aspheric nature of the cornea is ignored, and because of that, it results in some significant assumptions being made and some errors that occur particularly out toward the periphery of the eye. Also, there's some significant smoothing to try to account for certain things, including the fact that on all Placido disc topographers, there's a camera in the dead center of the instrument, so that all the data within the central 1 to 1.5 millimeter is all extrapolated data. It's not directly measured because the camera is physically there. And sometimes that area becomes very, very important, as we can see later in some future slides. Here's an example of a map that you see every day. This happens to be my eye from many, many years ago with some significant astigmatism. You can see how the Bowtie appearance that we see here. One of the things I wanted to point out on this map is the appearance of a map can vary very much depending on the way the color scale is derived or chosen. In this example, we have something called an Autosize map. An Autosize map is a map where we derive the color scheme, as you see on the color bar here on the left, by choosing the steepest point on that particular eye and coding it the darkest red, and then taking the flattest point on that particular eye and coding it the darkest blue. And this way we use all the color schemes in that particular eye, and it gives us the most data possible to distinguish the features of this eye. Now, this can get confusing because every eye represents a different power and a different color scheme. So dark red may be 47 in one eye and it could be 52 in another eye. So the color does not take upon an absolute value figure. So you have to pay attention to details when you use Autosize maps. On the other hand, the standard view, which is often the default measurement on many Placido disc topographers, will fix the color to the dioptic power. In this example, this is exactly the same eye, just with a different standard view, not Autosize map. And you see in this eye, and all eyes that are standard view with this machine, 50 equals dark red and 39 equals dark blue. And you can see here, you can see less detail in the standardized map, but if you are screening patients and you're doing it in a rapid fashion, you know what the colors mean. So basically when you use standard view, you can just say to yourself, if I see dark red, I know I'm probably in trouble because we're talking about a power of 49 or 50. So there's value to both color schemes, and it's a very important take-home message in this is know the color scheme that's on your machine, know what you're using, pay attention to it so you don't make some misinterpretations. In addition to axial and sagittal maps, we have tangential maps also, which are different because they're based on the instantaneous curvature change from ring to ring. And it's just using the standard mathematical formula to calculate that local radius of curvature along that point of a curve. And it's more sensitive to abrupt changes. So if you have eyes that have had surgery or eyes that have distortion, tangential maps can sometimes measure them more accurately. You get less smoothing, but the downside of tangential maps are you get more noise. And sometimes in patients, particularly with poor tear films or extremely distorted eyes, the noise can outweigh the reality of the data. So you need to have a careful balance between how much noise you may have, because you may interpret the maps to be real when it really is artifact. Most people say that if you're looking for keratoconus and you're using a Placido topographer, tangential maps are the best choice for identifying early keratoconus. There are also excellent maps for looking at contact lens corneal stability. If you're trying to see if a cornea is being warped by a contact lens, maybe a patient is getting ready for LASIK surgery and you want to see if their corneas are stable and you have a Placido topographer, tangential maps can be the best at seeing those subtle details. And here's just an example again of my eye with a tangential map. You notice it looks similar but not exactly the same as we saw previously with the axial sagittal maps. An important thing, because tear film is so important with Placido disc maps, is you need to look for missing data. If you see in this example of this patient's eye, it's telling you have corneal distortion, but really what you have is dry eye. In fact, all the white spots here are dry patches on the cornea where you have no data at all. And in fact, the blue areas here are indeed not areas of 33 dioptric curvature. Those are just lost data it's incomplete. So it's giving you false curvature measurements because the eye is so dry. So again, having a good stable tear film is key to having good Placido disc topographies. So what's important when you look at Placido disc topographies? Well, the first thing in my mind always is what is the shape of the topography? And there's lots of ways to look at shapes. One of the first studies published on corneal topography shapes that to me was very meaningful was a study published by Wilson back in 1992. And what Wilson did, he broke up shapes of topographies into 5 basic shapes: round, oval, symmetric, asymmetric, and irregular. And what he concluded, and I think it's a significant conclusion, is that 32%, or the most common shape with that 5-shape classification, was an asymmetric bow tie. So more patients had this asymmetry than any other single shape, and I think that's significant as we look at this. As subsequent paper came out by Rabinowitz that actually classified shapes even more carefully into 10 different categories, including round, oval, superior steep, inferior steep, irregular, symmetric bow ties, symmetric bow ties with SRAX, which is the skewed radial axis, asymmetric bow ties with inferior steepening, asymmetric bow ties with superior steepening, and finally number 10 and the most insidious is your asymmetric bow tie with the skewed radial axis. So again, shape is crucial, and by choosing the proper shape, you can give a risk analysis to a patient on their chances of having a cornea that's either in the process of developing keratoconus or susceptible to keratoconus. So here is how we classify the risk of the 10 shapes. And you see here, they're numbered 1 to 10, from round on number 1 down to number 10 on the asymmetric bow tie with skewed radial axis. And you'll see about 60% of them, which are color-coded in green, are all considered your normal topographies, your round, your oval, and your symmetric bow ties. So 2/3 of your patients have this kind of classification, and the majority of those are going to be normal eyes. On the other hand, if you look down at the red, number 10, the asymmetric bow tie with the skewed radial axis, this occurs in about 1 in 20 patients. And in my mind, when I see this, when I see an asymmetry combined with a skew, that's keratoconus until it's proven not keratoconus. And the way we do that is once we see this, we go right to the elevation topography, and Barry's going to show us some excellent examples of that in the second half of tonight's presentation. But the quandary always is those 30% of topographies, the yellow and orange here, the superior steep ones, the asymmetric bow ties that are superior steep, the irregulars, the inferior steep, the asymmetric bow ties that are inferior steep, and the symmetric bow ties that are skewed. These are the ones that always are the most difficult and always most controversial to classify on whether they are pre-keratoconus or actual frank keratoconus. And we're going to talk more about those as we go through this. One of the tools that we use to determine symmetry, because we know that as a patient develops keratoconus, not only is there asymmetry between their right eye and their left eye, there's asymmetry in the topography of the individual eyes. And in particular, we like to compare the superior part of the topography to the inferior part of the topography. And in most normal eyes, this comparison, there will be not much difference. But as we see patients developing keratoconus, that comparison of the superior to the inferior part will be different. And Rabinowitz developed a classification called the IS, or Inferior-Superior Index, which basically compares the superior cornea to the inferior cornea at points 3 millimeters off center. And what we simply do with this comparison is we look at an axial map, and we look 3 millimeters off center, and we choose 5 points 3 millimeters off center superior, and that's typically at 30, 60, 90, 120, and 150 degrees. We add them up and average them, and then we take 5 points inferior at the corresponding values. We add those up, we average them, and then we divide them by each other. A perfectly symmetrical map, you're going to get a division where it's going to be 1. When you have a difference, though, in these 2 points where it's 1.38 diopters, we start to become suspicious. When it's up to 1.9 diopters, then we say this patient has keratoconus till proven otherwise. Clinically, most of us in the clinic will use a 2 diopter cutoff as our abnormal IS ratio, but it can be a very handy tool just looking at the superior inferior and making that dioptic comparison and just subtract them and see what you get. Some very quick examples of shape classification. Here's an example of an oval central steepening or round topography. Here's an example of a patient with inferior steepening where you can see the inferior lobe of the astigmatism is much more prominent than the superior lobe. Here's an inferior asymmetric bow tie, or ABIS, again where you have prominent inferior steepening and less prominent superior lobe. Here's a less common but something we see of superior asymmetric bow tie that has no significant skew. Another example here where we get to the more insidious topographies. Here on the upper right-hand side, you see a symmetric bow tie but with a significant skew. In the literature, they claim 20 degrees is significant, and clearly this is probably less than 20 degrees, but in my mind still significant because every skew starts off as 0 and eventually goes towards a finite number. On the bottom left here, you see not only a skewing of the bow tie, but you see the inferior concentration of that bow tie. And you also start to see something where the 2 lobes begin to connect, and this is just a more advanced case of non-orthogonal astigmatism, and most commonly this can be keratoconus. But the other thing to keep in mind is to rule out contact lens warpage. This patient on the upper right-hand side actually turned out to be a patient with contact lens warpage from soft lens overwear. And once the lenses were discontinued, the topography normalized. So doing serial measurements are very helpful in making the differential diagnosis between a pathological disease like keratoconus and a disease caused by contact lens or a warpage caused by contact lens. And here's just another example where against the rule of astigmatism, here have the two lobes of the bow tie crossing over, and that's again an indication of possible pathology that warrants further investigation. So remember, I said that all patients with keratoconus begin with normal topographies, and then as you see in this example of this symmetric bow tie, eventually the bow ties become asymmetric. Typically, most commonly, as we know, keratoconus is usually inferior and usually inferior temporal. So you get an inferior temporal concentration of the bow tie with steepening. And then once it steepens, you then will start to see the skew. And the skew will continue until the skew gets worse and worse, and the lobes start to actually connect to each other with the crossover, and then ultimately it becomes the one big red spot. And as the disease gets more advanced, you get a bigger and steeper and redder spot, and that's how the topographies progress over time. And very important to know that whenever you see that skewing of the radial axis or one of those high-risk shaped topographies, particularly in with the skewed radial axis, that's something that warrants further investigation. A side note, one of the conditions, ectasia conditions, that most experts believe to be just a variant in location of normal keratoconus is a condition called pellucid's marginal degeneration, which is simply just keratoconus but located at the inferior limbus, classically within 1 to 2 millimeters of the inferior limbus. And what this condition shows us, as you can see in these two examples, is you see this classic bear claw or kissing dove appearance that we've all heard about with that inferior flattening of the cornea. The unique nature of these patients is they typically will exhibit significant against the rule minus cylinder in their prescriptions, and the other unique nature is that because this thinning is right at the 6 o'clock area on the cornea tends to fold in a very orthogonal or normal way that results in orthogonal astigmatism. And what that results in is many times these patients will be refractable in a phoropter to good best corrected vision. As you all know, when you see keratoconic patients and you try to put them in a phoropter, when they have 4, 5, 6 diopters of astigmatism, they will exhibit reduced best corrected vision because of the non-orthogonal nature of their astigmatism. True pellucid's patients will often have orthogonal astigmatism, and I've had patients with 6, 7, 8, 9 diopters of astigmatism with true PMD, and they can refract to 20/25 or 20/20. So it's just one characteristic difference we see clinically. But again, because all corneas start out normal, it's very difficult sometimes to know where is your patient in this scheme of things, and is your patient stable. And I think the safest thing always to do is when we're not sure is to repeat measurements over time. Do those serial measurements because, again, disease will worsen with time and normalized will actually stay the same with time. And if it's contact lens distortion, if you leave the lenses out, it often will improve with time. Other considerations, don't forget whenever you're looking for keratoconus, the things we talked about on the last webinar, the family history of keratoconus with the increased risk, the eye rubbing, especially with the palms and the knuckles, the asymmetric corneal astigmatism, usually of 0.75 is a trigger for looking for keratoconus, any subtle or significant losses of best corrected vision, particularly in one eye only, and also any elevation of vertical coma, and often in one eye or asymmetrically. We look for anything greater than 35 microns at 6 millimeters are all significant things. So try not to make diagnosis based on topography alone, but look at all the factors of the patient. So what are the limitations of Placido topography, and what are the issues with it, and why is it not good enough? Well, here's just an example of a patient when you misalign them or they're not looking in the right spot. You can take the exact same eye, but if the machine is looking at the eye at a skewed angle, you're going to produce an eye that looks inferior steep or looks skewed. And it is very possible to make a normal eye look abnormal if your technician doesn't have proper alignment or proper fixation. So that's a problem with Placido disc topography that doesn't happen with some of the other devices we'll talk about later. So in summary, the problems and the downsides of Placido topography are the following. Number one, it only measures the anterior surface of the cornea. There's no posterior corneal analysis. And what we've learned over the last decade is that many forms of ectasia, including keratoconus, begin on the back of the cornea. So if we want to diagnose it early, we really need to look at the back of the cornea. Placido topography cannot represent corneal thickness or develop corneal thickness profile maps. It also doesn't measure the center cornea because of the fact that the camera is there. We also have problems when you have bad tear films or irregular surfaces. These machines have very difficult times producing reliable maps. And also, even in the best case scenario, they only cover approximately 6 to 7 millimeters of an eye. Depending on the curvature of the eye, maybe you get out to 8, but you'll never get the full limbal-to-limbal coverage as you can get in many of the elevation machines we'll talk about shortly. So curvature in itself has those limitations, and again, these are some of the problems with Placido topography. So if Placido has limitations, then what is the next step or better? And in my opinion, the next better step is having the elevation measurements. So whenever you have topography, Placido topography, that shows an abnormality, you certainly should refer them for an elevation-based topography. In the United States, there are 3 basic machines out there that perform this analysis: the Pentacam by Oculus, the OrbScan by Bausch & Lomb, and the Galilei by Zimmer. And all these machines perform what we call a tomography, and the difference between that is a tomography is a 2-dimensional image or a slice through a 3-dimensional object, so it gives us a little bit different view. And with the Pentacam, it utilizes something called a Schleimflug camera to produce this Schleimflug image, which provides this extended depth of focus so we can keep the cornea in focus at all its different meridians and heights at the same time. And the way it does this is by utilizing a slit lamp beam that rotates in a circle around, and depending on which version of the Pentacam, it takes anywhere between 50 and 100 screenshots in about a 2-second to give the best resolution and detection in 3-dimensional space of the front of the cornea, not the tear film, but the front of the cornea, and the back of the cornea, giving us true elevation data. So it provides us not only the elevation of the front of the cornea, but the elevation of the back of the cornea, and then by calculation it can also give us a true pachymetric map of the entire eye. And we can also derive, using mathematics, curvature data, which is actually more accurate than getting curvature data from Placido disc topography. So first thing to find out is when you look at a OrbScan or a Pentacam or a Galilei, how is the information displayed? You're not looking at the raw data, but what you're looking at is the data that is plotted against a reference surface. And in my opinion, looking for keratoconus early astigmatic changes, we want to use a non-astigmatic, non-aspheric surface so that we can look for these subtle abnormalities. So we use what's called a best fit sphere to best see the changes that occur in early keratoconus. With the Pentacam and an OrbScan and a Galilei, what we traditionally use is something called a 4-map refractive display. And the 4 maps that are typically on this display are, number 1, a front elevation map, number 2, a back elevation map, number 3, a corneal thickness profile map, and then number 4, finally, a mathematically calculated sagittal map of the cornea. And this is just a typical presentation, as you see in this patient, of the patient's right eye. And the maps can be in different color schemes, and depending on the purpose you're using these machines for, you may want to use one color scheme called the American color scheme. The advantage of the American color scheme is it finds the optical apex very easy of the eye, which can be helpful for fitting contact lenses or for helping making the diagnosis of keratoconus. On the other hand, you may want to use something called the Belin intuitive color scheme. The Belin intuitive color scheme, and this is the same eye that's represented in 2 different color schemes, is very about showing early islands of astigmatism, which is particularly what we want to look for in early keratoconus. As you can see on this patient's back of their cornea, you can see these subtle little islands of astigmatism on that back elevation map with this Belin intuitive color scheme. And from visual inspection, the Belin intuitive color scheme helps make those islands pop out and become more visually visible to us. As we see in this example of a more advanced case of keratoconus, one of the things that we also note is in true keratoconus, we see excessive elevation on the front of the eye, but when we compare it to the back of the eye always have more elevation than the front of the eye. And that's the definition, and what happens physically in keratoconus is, and we're going to talk more about this, but the surface of the eyes move forward, and the back surface moves more forward than the front, resulting in this excessive back elevation that has to be at the same general location as the front elevation. And we also notice that the patient's thinnest point, which is the hollow circle, is coincident with the areas of elevation on the front of the back of the eye, which is classic for the diagnosis of keratoconus. The Pentacam also helps us provide us make many other diagnosis. Only it does more than just corneal topography. It looks at the anterior chamber, it gives us assessments of the anterior chamber depth. So certain types of glaucoma can be very helpful looking at this and showing us changes outside the normative data. The indices display is just one more aspect of the Pentacam that can be very helpful. Another very helpful aspect of the Pentacam is the global pachymetry map, as we saw in the previous 4-map refractives. Much more useful than a handheld ultrasound thickness of the cornea because it shows us the profile and it measures how the cornea thickens from its thinnest point in concentric measurements going out toward the periphery. And the value of watching how a cornea thickens will help us make the diagnosis of keratoconus. And here's just an example of what we call a pachymetric progression map, and they can be mapped two different ways. On the top we see here the corneal thickness spatial profile, or the CTSP map, and what this does, this red line represents your patient's eye, and the 3 black lines represent a 2 standard deviation of normal. So in normal patients, your red line should be well within the 2 standard deviations of normal, but it should also take on the same slope or the same thickening from its thinnest point out to the limbus. It should thicken. And we see in this patient here, this red line actually takes on a different slope than the normative data. And that's something, when we see this line droop downwards, we worry about keratoconus. When we see this line start to flatten out, we actually worry about corneal thickening, cases of fuchs dystrophy, or even normal aging. With patients as they age, we see this red line start to flatten out. Down below is the same exact information, just replotted as a percentage of thickness versus an absolute value of thickness. And I prefer the PTI map because visually I can usually tell more about the patient's eye when I look at the PTI map, but they really are the same information, just plotted in a slightly different way. So before I turn this over to Dr. Eiden, I just want to summarize is when you are looking for keratoconus in elevation topography, you need to really focus your concentration around the thinnest point. We know that keratoconus is a thinning disease of the cornea, but unlike keratoglobus, where it's a thinning disease of the whole cornea, keratoconus is a localized thinning, typically anywhere between 4 and 5 millimeters around the thinnest point. So if we're looking for keratoconus, we need to start the inspection at the thinnest point of the cornea, and that will give us the most success and have the most sensitive and specific result. Also keep in mind, and don't forget, that since it's an asymmetric disease, always compare the right eye to the left eye. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Dr. Eiden.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill. That was really a great presentation. I'm going to get my slides going here, and I hope everybody can see that slide. And we're going to now kind of get into the disease elements. Bill did a phenomenal job in talking about the basic concepts of Placido topography, some of the limitations of Placido topography. But since so many of us use that type of technology as opposed to having access to elevation-based systems, it's really important to try to utilize it in its most sensitive way, and really Bill did a great job in identifying some of those things that you can take home or take back to your office actually even tomorrow and really start applying. So I'm going to concentrate initially now on talking about elevation-based corneal tomography specific to the Pentacam system by Oculus, based on the fact that that's what we used at our practice and probably is the most widely used of these systems, at least surely in the United States, if not the world. So Bill really did talk about elevation and how important that is. And if you really think about it, when we look at a cornea and we're thinking about where is the top of the cone or where are points on the surface of the cornea that we're concerned about aligning in contact lenses. It's really elevation that we should be looking at. There are many of us out there who really don't even spend much time looking at curvature maps. They specifically look at these elevation maps as the most important diagnostic points of information. And here we can see an example on your left here of a normal astigmatic patient's elevation map on the front of the cornea. And you could see that 90-degree separation between the high point and low point. One of the things that confuses people at the beginning is the color scheme most of these systems use, because when you look at elevation, the steep meridian is usually cooler in color, whereas in curvature it's usually warmer. So you kind of get used to that very quickly after a while. As you can see, this is actually the steep meridian close to the vertical meridian, and those cooler colors are actually falling off, if you think about it, or more posteriorly located, whereas the warmer colors along more the horizontal are actually more anterior or higher on that surface. But let's compare that to the front surface of a keratoconic eye, where you can see that localized apex of the cone. And in this particular case, we don't have a lot of regular astigmatism kind of superimposed, but there are some cases where you can actually see a combination of both of these as well. So we can tell by looking at the difference between these two on the front surface, which is the more normal eye and which is the more abnormal eye. And we'll show you cases where curvature leads you to think you have an abnormality, and elevation proves to you that you actually don't. So often the story is actually on the back side of the cornea, as Bill mentioned, because we now know that when it comes to keratoconus and those forms of ectasia, that those changes in the cornea actually elevation-wise do occur initially and more greatly on the back surface. And this on your left is an example of a posterior elevation map with that localized anteriorly displaced portion, which corresponds to the apex of the cone. As Bill mentioned, and we'll review in a couple of seconds again, the back being more anteriorly displaced than the front causes a localized thinning. It's intuitive if you think about it. Well, you know, we showed this slide before. We talked about what Placido topography was missing, just like the iceberg under the surface. When you're not looking at the back of the cornea, well, that's really missing a lot of data. So let's just take a look at an example. Here we can see on your left a sagittal curvature map that actually looks pretty normal. Most of us would look at that and say that doesn't look abnormal at all. But if you look at the posterior surface of that patient using an elevation map, you see that hot spot. And when you're looking only at the anterior surface, even when you're only looking at anterior surface for both curvature and elevation, and you're not looking at the back, it's truly a half of an exam. And in this particular case, what you didn't know can hurt you, especially if you're doing only anterior surface evaluation in pre-LASIK or pre-other refractive surgical procedures. This can end up in a big problem for you with the outcomes from those procedures. So let's take a look at this. This is actually a curvature map from a Placido-based topography system. And I think most of us who use Placido topography would look at this and say, this is kind of suspicious. As Bill mentioned, an asymmetric bow tie with that kind of really hot spot, especially in the left eye, even more than in the right eye. But if we take this exact same patient and we run a Pentacam analysis, let's take a look and see what happens. Well, first let's look upper right, and we put the sagittal curvature data from the Pentacam for that patient in that position. And what do you notice? You notice it kind of looks like the Placido topographer, because curvature is curvature is curvature. And the only time they would have dramatic differences is if that curvature finding was due to a misalignment that occurs with Placido topography. But there are other reasons why you can get this asymmetry top to bottom in a normal eye. So in this particular case, there's probably a decentration of the apex of that particular cornea in terms of curvature. So it looks similar to the Placido topographer. But if we look at the elevation maps, both on the front and on the back, they have much more normal astigmatic patterns. As you can see, that 90-degree separation. You don't see that centralized hot spot. And if you look at the thickness map, my goodness, this cornea is pretty darn thick. Now, I don't have a display of the pachymetric progression that Bill alluded to in this particular case, but suffice to say it was normal. So this was a patient who had a suspicious difference in their curvature value based on superior inferior, but the elevation data was perfectly normal and the global pachymetric data was perfectly normal. This patient does not have keratoconus at all. So keratoconus actually equals corneal steepening, elevation, and resultant thinning. Both, as Bill mentioned, the anterior and posterior surface move forward in keratoconus, but the posterior surface is more anteriorly displaced than the anterior surface, so that results in the localized thinning. And we can see that in this particular example, where we have in upper left the curvature map. So you do see the steepening. You can see that inferior steepening, the non-orthogonal kind of skewed axis that Bill referred to, but you do see the elevation anomaly here. We're not going into all the details of what normal and what abnormal in terms of these absolute numbers are, but suffice to say these numbers are way out of normal. And look at the back. The back is virtually, in terms of microns, almost twice as anteriorly displaced from the reference surface as the anterior surface is. And what does that cause? That same point, that same location is going to be thin. So we see anterior displacement, more pronounced posterior anterior displacement. When I say anterior, I mean the direction. So on the anterior surface, we have anterior displacement. On the posterior surface, we have anterior displacement, but a much greater value with the resultant localized thinning in that coincident location, as you can see. What about locating the cone? You know, so many of us who have been using the Placido topography for so many years, and we look and we see that inferior, we think that's where the apex of the cone is. But only elevation data tells you where the apex of the cone is. So let's look. It actually here is, and in most cases this occurs, more central, more superior than the steepest point in the cornea. That's just curvature. This is actual elevation data, back of cornea, here on the front of the cornea. So that is where the apex of the cone is. And if you're going to actually fit a contact lens, a corneal contact lens, those lenses tend to want to center over the most anteriorly displaced or highest point of the cornea. That's where you know you're going to get that decentration of your lens, and you're going to have to kind of try to fight that because you want to get the lens to center its optics over the visual axis. And because of the shape and elevation of this cornea, especially on the front, it's going to want to center more inferiorly, as you'd expect. And we have to do design changes to address that. Bill wonderfully talked about pachymetric progression. And the truth of the matter is, in terms of sensitivity for picking up disease, just measuring the thinnest point on the cornea is not the most sensitive way to pick up ectasia. It is the change in corneal thickness from that thin point out to the periphery that is where all the action is. So let's look at a case. And we can see here, in this particular case, that this is a fairly mild case of keratoconus. Yes, we have inferior steepening on sagittal curvature. We do have some abnormality, virtually borderline abnormality, of this localized area of anterior displacement on the front of the cornea, but definitive abnormality when we look at the back of the cornea. Well, here's something interesting. Look, we do have that decentration of the thin point, but look at the value. At the thinnest point, which we see right here, is 523 microns. Statistically, that's normal. But it's not that point that's that important. It's the change in thickness from that point out to the periphery, which I'm going to show you on those displays that Bill mentioned. So if we look at the absolute thickness of the cornea from center to periphery, what do you see? You do see that it remains within the normal range from the center all the way out to the periphery. Yes, you do see that little dip that Bill talked about, and that is a suspicious little dip, but it's still normal. So statistically, if all you did was measure that thin point, you would think that it's perfectly normal. But now let's look at the PTI, or the percentage thickness increase, or the rate of change of thickness when we go from that thin point out to the periphery. It's outside the normal range. It's outside 2 standard deviations. So this, although it's derived from the same information, looking at the PTI is a more sensitive way to pick up abnormalities than just by looking at the absolute change in thickness in terms of microns from center to periphery. It's the rate of change that's actually more sensitive. Here we can see a more advanced case where both the absolute thickness is abnormal near the center of the cone. Apex of the cone, it's outside 2 standard deviations. As it thickens, it gets into the normal range, and again, that inferior dipping that Bill mentioned. But look at the PTI, it's blatantly abnormal, way abnormal. That's a more advanced case. So when we want to use this type of information from Pentacam, just looking at the 4-map refractive, we can see that we get abnormal pachymetric map in terms of the progression of pachymetry and the decentration of the thin point from the center further out, typically, in most cases, inferiorly and inferior temporal, as Bill mentioned before. We have significant anterior elevation of the apex of the cone, both on the anterior and posterior surface, but virtually always greater on the posterior surface. And yes, of course, we do get abnormal curvature values as well that occur secondary to these changes. So this all together equals keratoconus. So there are ways, though, that have been developed and are in the Pentacam software that make us even more sensitive in picking up abnormalities. And there's something that's called the Belin-Ambrosio ectasia analysis or ectasia display in Pentacam that uses a really interesting method. And what it does, it creates a new type of reference sphere surface. Remember, Bill mentioned elevation is based on relative elevation compared to what we use typically is a spherical surface, best fit sphere for the front, best fit sphere for the back. Now, that sphere elevation is going to be influenced by the entire elevation of that particular cornea. So the localized steepening, or not steepening, excuse me, the localized elevation anteriorly on the back and front of the cornea is going to influence the actual reference sphere. So in this particular method, using the BAD or Belin-Ambrosio display, we exclude a 3.5 or so area, a millimeter area zone that's centered around the thinnest point of the cornea, and then create a new reference sphere. And I'll show you that. See, in eyes with keratoconus, the area of maximum anterior elevation, or the cone apex, actually causes a steepening of the best fit sphere. This causes the early forms of keratoconus not to be as easily detected in some of the standard displays. And if we take away that central information around that 3.5 millimeter area around the thin point of the cornea, we do change the best fit sphere calculation, and that increases the sensitivity in being able to see that it's abnormal. And I'm going to show you an example right now. So right up here, we can see that in a keratoconic eye, using all of the elevation data to create a best fit sphere, it's quite steep and anteriorly displaced, as you can see. But if we eliminate the 3 millimeters around the thin point of that cornea, that whole reference sphere actually goes down, and the space difference over the apex becomes greater and more obvious, which I'll show you in a moment. Apply the same method to a normal non-keratoconic cornea, those reference spheres are going to be exactly the same. They don't change because the data around the thin point of the cornea really doesn't do anything to change that reference sphere. So I think we're going to see an example here. For example, up top, we have an example where we have a normal cornea, and we have the standard reference sphere and the enhanced reference sphere. There's no big difference. We're not really seeing much of a difference at all. But if we look at an abnormal cornea, keratoconic cornea, when we apply the regular reference sphere, you do see that anterior elevation. I would be alarmed by that, and I would realize that. But it surely becomes much more obvious when you exclude that central zone around the 3.5 millimeters around the thin point and create a different reference sphere, so the top of the cone actually is higher, more anteriorly displaced from that reference sphere in this particular example. Now we can see an entire display of the original Belin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia display, and we can see the standard best fit sphere, the enhanced best fit sphere, and the difference between the two. Here on this side is the anterior surface, and on this side, the posterior surface. In this particular case, the anterior surface didn't have much going on. So there really wasn't much difference between the enhanced best fit sphere and the standard best fit sphere. The difference is virtually non-existent. But looking at the back, there is quite a difference, and you can see that in the difference display. Now, that information is used in determining with this software whether the software thinks it recognizes ectasia. And that's what these bottom, what we call the D values, represent. And each one represents a different element that are all used together to look at the overall D value, and that's the one we look at for a positive or negative. So it will show up in red when it is significantly abnormal. There can be some borderline in yellow, and white is typically normal. Now, a more advanced version over the last few years came out called the Belin-Ambrosio display number 3, and it added a couple of other kinds of ways that help in the sensitivity in detecting ectasia. Most of those related to thickness profile changes. Also, what it did is realize that there is actually a difference in abnormal versus normal if the patient is myopic or hyperopic. So you would press this little button if you actually had a hyperopic patient, and it actually changed the normative database because it actually is, in fact, different. So I want to now talk about the next level of development of really interesting things, because I think the basic Pentacam itself, especially with the Belin-Ambrosio display, utilizing elevation and utilizing global pachymetric data, really does a great job, in my mind, of allowing us to diagnose keratoconus, and at a very early phases. However, the question becomes, what about progression? And with the advent of corneal cross-linking, everything is about progression because we can now control progression. So we have to figure out what are the values, what are the measurements that seem to be the most sensitive at picking up progression. And we have to utilize those values and document them over time to detect that progression. So from initial work that was published over the past year or so, we realized that there are 3 values that seem to be the most sensitive at detecting progression, not detecting disease, but detecting progression. And one would be that minimum corneal thickness value. And we said it's not quite as important in detection of disease, it's really the change in thickness. But in progression, that is an important and valuable measure. Second is a measurement we call the ARC, or anterior radius of curvature. And this is a radius of curvature on the front of the cornea that is exclusively measured within an area 3 millimeters centered around the thin point. It's not the overall anterior radius of curvature, but it's just that localized little radius of curvature within that 3 millimeter zone. Then we have the PRC, or posterior radius of curvature value, which is the same as the ARC, but on the back of the cornea. In essence, it's a measurement of the posterior radius of curvature within an area, again, 3 millimeters centered around the thin point. And these 3 values are really important values for detecting progression. Now, the question is, how much of a change is statistically and clinically significant? Well, there are some values that are starting to come out at this particular point in time based upon some limited data of normative information. And I think over time, studies are going to improve. We're going to have really better ways to detect whether or not progression based on these statistics is truly occurring. So I think we need to be on the outlook for that ourselves over time. We're going to see our ability to really determine whether progression of keratoconus is occurring based on these particular values. And so I wanted to show you a case. This was somebody we just actually saw, I think it was on Monday, at our practice. And you could see this is a patient with blatantly, moderately advanced keratoconus. Their maximum curvature on the front of the cornea is close to 70 diopters. We can see that inferior steepening oval type of cone. We can see a significant anterior displacement on the elevation of the front of the cornea, a greater elevation anteriorly displaced on the back, as always happens. And we can see that this is a moderately thin cornea, not excessively thin, thinnest point being 460 microns, but we can see the coincident nature of those particular 3 points. But now let's look at the display where we can see the ARC values the PRC values and the thin point values here. Now, there is a staging of keratoconus called the Belin ABCD keratoconus staging method, and you can actually put in there also, we didn't do it, but you can put in the best corrected spectacle acuity, best corrected spectacle acuity in that area. And here on a scale of 0 to 4, the A value or the ARC value is a stage 4. The B value or the PRC value is also a stage 4. The C value or the corneal thickness thin point value is only a 1 out of 4. Just because it's only 460 microns. Let's say that cornea was 250 microns, it would probably be a 4, a level 4. I didn't have any display on what the value is for D because we didn't actually have a value. How important is it to have staging? Yeah, me personally, from a clinical standpoint, not very important. Because what's important to me is detecting the disease, and then once to detect the disease, to determine if the patient is progressing or not, or at high risk for progression. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we're utilizing Pentacam technology, elevation-based Scheimpflug tomography for keratoconus detection and for the detection of progression, which, as we stated, is just so very important. So now let's just move on to the next technology, and one that probably more than elevation tomography is in optometric offices and even ophthalmological offices, and that is OCT technology. And most of the OCT systems today have the ability to do anterior segment OCT measurements. So we're going to talk about the value of anterior segment OCT in keratoconus. So I would identify, in my mind, 3 values. One is just imaging the cornea, because anterior segment OCT today is amazingly high resolution, so we can actually image how the cornea looks. Secondly, overall thickness. Just like in the Scheimpflug tomography, the anterior segment OCT can give us a global pachymetry map and can tell us the thickness within central, right at this point 6 millimeters, but there are changes coming up with other systems going out as far as 9 millimeters for a measurement of corneal thickness, and that's global pachymetry. And what's really exciting and new is something that we call epithelial thickness mapping, where we're actually measuring the thickness of the epithelium, and we'll show you in a few moments why we think that might be another very sensitive indicator of early onset of keratoconus. So here are just some examples of how in a keratoconic patient we might want to just use the anterior segment OCT for imaging. You can see an advanced disease with significant stromal scarring here. Here we see a case of a patient who's had intracorneal ring segments or intacts placed into the cornea, as showing this beautiful, amazingly high resolution, exquisite detail of anterior segment OCT of the cornea. But that really doesn't do anything in terms of diagnosis, just makes pretty pictures. Where we can use it is for measurement values. And those of us who fit a lot of scleral lenses or vaulting lenses, we use anterior OCT to measure the vault of the lens over even some of the most advanced cases of ectasia. As you can see, one of my patients here with an amazingly advanced form of keratoconus, and we fit that particular patient with a customized prosthetic scleral shell called the iPrint, in fitting and allowing that patient to continue to maintain vision and preclude the need for a corneal transplant at this particular point in time. But now I want to get into the thickness maps, because I think that's where the action is. We talked about overall thickness. Yes, right now with all the systems that are out there, we can measure within typically a 6 millimeter area global pachymetry of the cornea. And we could see here a keratoconic patient showing that localized thinning that we get on the global pachymetry map. What is actually missing, unfortunately, so far in the anterior segment OCT systems that is amazingly advanced in Pentacam technology is the statistical analysis of the global pachymetry. So right now in anterior segment OCT systems that we have, we can just look at it, we can get measurements in terms of microns of corneal thickness anywhere within that 6 millimeter zone, but we don't have any statistical analysis, we don't have any idea about progression, and so on and so forth. However, that's going to change. There are studies going on right now using various systems are starting to look at pachymetric indices with anterior segment OCT, being able to give median thickness values, focal thinning values, asymmetric, superior, inferior, and such. And all of these kinds of statistical or indices are going to be able to be looked at from a statistical normative database point of view and help us in determining normal from abnormal. So we should be on the lookout for that being added software-wise to anterior segment OCT systems in the hopefully very near future. But now I want to share with you something that we've had some experience with in our practice over the last about 6 months, and that is the ability to not only measure the overall corneal thickness, but to be able to measure the thickness of the epithelial layer. Because of the exquisite nature of this technology in resolution, it can actually measure the thickness of the epithelium, measuring from the corneal surface to Bowman's layer, and give us epithelial thickness maps. And here's an example of an epithelial thickness map, central 6 millimeters at this point, just like the overall global thickness map. And when we look at that in keratoconus, here is a paper that was published in 2013 looking at 3 different groups and looking at the profile of mean epithelial thickness. Up here in blue are normal eyes. In the green, we get this central thinning, and that's in a post-LASIK ectasia population of patients. And then finally, look at the more dramatic central thinning that was found in the paper for the keratoconic patient population. So that's typical of what we'll see in keratoconus, this localized central thinning and surrounding thickening of the epithelium in keratoconus. Now the question really becomes, is this, and we believe that it is, an early indicator that may occur even before global thickness changes in the cornea? So we can see here an example that if you look at the overall global pachymetry, it's not really showing a lot. You can kind of sense maybe there's a little thinning in this particular area, but when we look at the epithelial thickness map, you can see significant thinning down here inferiorly and relative thickening just superior to that area, as you can see where the apex of that cone would be. Now, we'll be developing even more sophisticated analysis in the near future. What I'm showing you now is not available on the system yet, but is being looked at, and that is applying some of the same logic as we do in visual fields to these epithelial thickness maps. And that is having normative data, having the pattern map, and then doing a subtraction between the two, looking for the difference from normal. And so that will show in a more dramatic way when we're dealing with abnormalities using what we would call these pattern deviation maps. Again, similar to the way we do in threshold perimetry. So we can see that thinning over the corneal apex and the surrounding thickening that is common. What I'm going to show you next, actually, again, are a couple of cases from our practice over the last couple of weeks where we applied both Pentacam and we applied anterior segment OCT corneal thickness map measurements. We can see here quite a moderate keratoconic patient, fairly steep cornea, large oval, inferiorly displaced cone, and we would say that this would be, a moderate form of keratoconus. Let's look at where the global thickness is measured for about 6 millimeters with the anterior segment OCT. That's where it's measuring it compared to the overall greater area that we're able to, at this point, measure with the Pentacam. So when we look at the thickness maps, they're going to be a little bit skewed because it's kind of compressed in that area. And here's that patient. We can see here on the left, that's the global thickness. We can see within that central 6 millimeter area that slightly inferiorly displaced relative thinning. But now we look here at the epithelial thickness, and you can see that's even more dramatically asymmetric than the global thickness. And that gives us the feeling, and we're starting to see some cases here and there where we may have normal overall thickness maps and start to show some abnormalities of epithelial thickness, potentially being an early indicator of disease, as we can see here. And here's the other eye in the patient. And this eye, interestingly enough, is actually correctable to 20/20. We know it doesn't look quite normal. We see the inferior steepening. We kind of see a slight anterior elevation that's still within statistical normal here with an astigmatic pattern. We see a semi-regular, maybe slightly irregular astigmatic pattern on the back surface with a, let's say, a mild abnormality of the elevation above what we would consider normal, and the decentration and thinning of the cornea. This particular patient also had an abnormal PTI as well. And we could see that area of thickness we're going to measure with the anterior segment OCT, and in that particular case, we can see that same pattern occur in the normal eye, where you can actually see that localized little bit of thinning. It's not as dramatic for sure. To see that here. Now let's look at another patient, and we would say that this would definitely be an abnormal Pentacam, curvature anomaly, elevation front anomaly, elevation posterior anomaly with overlying astigmatic pattern, and we can see the decentration of the thin point. This particular patient, if we look at their epithelial thickness map, look how more dramatic that it is in its display compared to the overall thickness map. You get that relative thickening up here, the relative thinning here, which we don't see quite as dramatically. But what's going to be interesting is to look at the other eye, because the other eye on Pentacam comes out statistically normal. Look at the curvature, that's normal. Elevation, you know, yes, there's a questionable area here, but there's no corresponding posterior elevation in the same area, and there's no corresponding thin point in that same area. This doesn't quite mesh as a typical keratoconic map. And if we look at the Belin-Ambrosio 3 ectasia display, look at those D values. They're all normal. So this patient, when we run the analysis for ectasia using the Pentacam, comes out normal. But let's now look at the corneal thickness on anterior segment OCT. Overall thickness, I wouldn't call that abnormal, but let's look at the epithelial thickness. Isn't this interesting? Maybe not so much thinning in this area, but relative thickening here. So we don't know. We're going to, you know, does this change? Does this progress over time? We're just going to have to find out. It's just very early in our understanding of this particular technology. So epithelial thickness mapping and anterior segment OCT may provide early detection of keratoconus. It may show, in many cases, that actual what we thought was unilateral keratoconus is not truly unilateral keratoconus, and there are many who believe that unilateral keratoconus does not exist, that even if you can't pick it up with our technologies today, that the other eye that seems normal still has probably abnormal collagen. And some of these other tests that we're talking about, epithelial thickness might pick it up, and we'll talk about biomechanics in a few moments, and that may pick it up as well. And that, of course, this type, as well as any of these diagnostic technologies, they're all synergistic. You don't use one technology in exclusion of the others. Putting them all together, utilizing the strengths of each, really makes it a much more powerful way in making a diagnosis and making the determination of progression or no progression. A system that probably won't go very far in terms of clinical applications, because it's kind of a unidimensional system, is using high-frequency ultrasound. But using high-frequency ultrasound, this is an example of a system called the Artemis system, it also can measure epithelial thickness as well as overall thickness in keratoconus. And here we can see that classic central thinning surrounding, with a surrounding area of thickening of that map as well. So let's go on to the next, which I find amazingly exciting, and this is technology that we're just starting to get our hands on in practice and working on some clinical studies, and that is looking at the corneal biomechanical properties in keratoconus and ectasia. And right now there are basically two systems that we can use that can measure these particular things. One is the Ocular Response Analyzer, or the ORA, by Reichert, and the other is the Corvus system by Oculus, which is what we've been using over the past couple of months. And I need to tell you at this particular point, the software that looks at the biomechanical properties of the cornea through the Corvus system is yet to receive FDA approval. We hope it's in the near future, and once that happens, that can be released through anybody who buys the particular system right now. If you bought it right now in the United States, you wouldn't have that software, but the system would give you central corneal thickness. It would give you corrected IOP measurements based on both the biomechanics and the central corneal thickness, but it wouldn't give you the specific biomechanical outcomes that I'm going to share with you, and the software that I'm going to share with you, which right now is awaiting FDA approval. So what is Corvus? Corvus is corneal visualization using shine fluke technology. And basically what it does is it uses a high-speed shine fluke imaging system, has 8 millimeters of coverage, and it combines that with a non-contact, in essence, air puff tonometer. And it creates a video response of the cornea to that air puff, as you can see that deformation that occurs when that puff of air blows against the cornea. And the system has the ability to measure the changes to the corneal shape in response to that air puff over time. We can get, with this system, very accurate measurement of IOP that's accurate based upon corneal thickness measurements as well as the biomechanical properties of the cornea. So where does this have application? Well, it has many applications. We're going to talk about its application in early detection of keratoconus. It's also going to be important, we expect and hope, for picking up progression of ectasia and keratoconus and evaluating the effect of corneal cross-linking, because we think the biomechanical properties of the cornea should be measurably improved after corneal cross-linking. But we also have its applications in glaucoma and in predictions for other types of procedures. I believe, for example, those in optometry who are doing corneal reshaping treatment or ortho-K, I have a feeling that these measurements may end up being good predictors on how a patient's going to respond to corneal reshaping. We're probably going to try to put together studies in that regard over the coming year or two. So here's just, what looks like a very complicated printout or display from the Corvus, but basically it's able to, and this again is the software that's not available, not approved yet FDA-wise, we hope it will be soon, but it will give you a screening report, and it will give you, standard deviations based on normative data as well. Overall, it's going to give you this Corvus biomechanical index value. And as you can see, the green, yellow, and red, meaning normal, borderline, and abnormal, an overall assessment of the biomechanical properties of that cornea based on the Corvus outcomes. And I think at the beginning of the talk, Bill talked about the work that Cynthia Roberts at Ohio State has done with Corvus, looking at keratoconus. Here's the outcomes of one of those studies that showed significant differential between normalized and keratoconic eyes, and a whole host of measurement values that can be derived from the Corvus technology. This particular measurement, the Corvus biomechanical index, also has great sensitivity and specificity for the detection of keratoconus. Over 98% positive predictive value in differentiating normal from keratoconic eyes. So that's very, very sensitive and specific, and that's very, very helpful for us in early diagnosis. Here we can see two Corvus videos superimposed one on top of the other, and take a look at the difference between a normally thin cornea and an equally thin but keratoconic cornea. Do you see how the deformation from the puff is much greater in the keratoconic cornea? And the other thing that happens, if you look carefully, is kind of like the jiggle in its return back to its normal state is greater as well. So we see in keratoconic corneas a significant increase in the deformation amplitude and an increase in the oscillation of the cornea after that air puff. Here we can see an example of a pre- and post-surgical keratoconic cornea. Up top, pre-surgical, and post-intacs on the bottom. And you could see there was a change in the deformation amplitude, that the deformation was greater before the intacs versus without, and the thought that the intacs may lend some biomechanical stability to the keratoconic cornea as well. Kind of interesting. Well, what's really interesting and really exciting to me is what Oculus is doing from a statistical analysis and practical display point of view for both Pentacam and Corvus. Because what they've done is create the ability to take data from both of these systems and to analyze them together and to come up with some statistical ways to look at whether we're dealing with normal versus abnormal. We're combining both the tomographical and the biomechanical assessments from these two instruments. And we can see that printout that is going to be available in the not too distant future, hopefully. And we can see basically here, some of the biomechanical data, and we can see differentials between normative data on normal eyes and keratoconic eyes and how they differentiate from each other based on these biomechanical measurements. And of course, the 4-map refractive that comes off of the Pentacam. And what we come up with together is a TBI index, which is combining tomographic and biomechanical data. So this is really exciting in my judgment. So let's look at a case. Is there really unilateral keratoconus? So here in this particular case on the right side, you can see here, this is just an axial curvature map, looks pretty darn normal in that right eye. Here we can see on the left eye the skewed radial axis and asymmetric bow tie Bill talked about in curvature, and that is very, very significantly associated with abnormalities and typically keratoconus. So we can see that tomographically that the right eye is normal and the left eye is abnormal. We'll actually see the 4-map refractive in just a second. Here we go. So here is the right eye in the entire 4-map refractive of a normal eye. Okay, this looks absolutely normal in this particular case. Elevation's normal on the front and on the back. The thickness is normal, and the curvature in this particular case on the right eye is absolutely normal. We look at the Belin Ambrosio, as you would expect, perfectly normal all the way through. Nothing is abnormal. No differences in the enhanced best fit spheres, front or back. No anomalies in thickness changes from center to periphery, and the overall assessment is that it would be negative for ectasia in this right eye. So we now look at the combined outcome, and it would show here that we found a biomechanical abnormality in that right eye. But we found normal tomographic outcomes. When we combine them into the TBI, it is abnormal. So this is a case where in this right eye, we would have thought it had no keratoconus. It was normal based on Pentacam, but the Corvus said, no, the biomechanical properties are more similar to an abnormal eye and suspicious to keratoconus, especially when we put it in context of what the left eye looks like. The left eye tomography is blatantly abnormal. I don't have to go over the details. We've talked about that before. But now when we look at that combined printout, we see at way abnormal biomechanical elements on the CBI. We see way abnormal Belin Ambrosio, and of course way abnormal TBI, or the combination of both of them. And when you put this in the same patient's head, we know this left eye, we know the abnormality on the right eye is biomechanical abnormality, probably due to keratoconus, and it would be very interesting to see if that changes over the years to come. So now we look at that iceberg, and now we're saying maybe tomography is looking at the top of the iceberg, and corneal biomechanical properties are giving us even a further view down below the surface. So there's always more to go. Very, very exciting in this field of biomechanics of the cornea, and again, more to learn. The next thing I want to spend just a few quick minutes on is the use of aberrometry in keratoconus detection. And we know that in our refractive techniques that we do in our office every day, we're only measuring low order aberrations, sphere and cylinder and the axis of that cylinder. But there are many other forms of visual distortion that we call high order aberrations. And up until recently we couldn't measure them, but now we have clinically available instruments in our practices that can not only detect and measure, they can quantify and differentiate where the source of these high order aberrations are coming from with combined systems that utilize overall wavefront aberrometry along with measurement of corneal topography. So a high order aberration is any refractive error that cannot be corrected with traditional spherocylindrical lens combinations. And studies show that upwards of 17% of all of the aberrations of the eye, that 17% of the total aberrations of the eye are from high order aberrations in normal eyes. So all of us have some degree of high order aberrations in our system. Nobody has a perfect visual system with no high order aberrations. This is about as good as it can get. This shows you on these kind of bar graphs the low order aberrations in a patient with 20/10 uncorrected vision and no significant refractive error. Their low order aberrations are extremely low, and their high order aberrations are extremely low. This person has about as good a visual system as one could ever have. Here's a case of just a patient who has refractive error but doesn't have a very high amount of high order aberrations. Yes, do they have some? Of course, we all have some. But this particular patient should be able to get really darn good vision with a pair of glasses or properly fit contact lenses. Let's compare that to a keratoconic who's just messed up on all levels. And we know that in keratoconus we have a lot of low order aberrations, a lot of astigmatism, high spherical refractive error often, but we have tremendous amount of high order aberrations, due both, by the way, to the anterior and posterior surface of the cornea. Yes, the interface between an index of refraction difference on the anterior surface is much more impactful, but the posterior surface does have an influence as well. And this is the case from our office in utilizing our aberrometry system in a keratoconic patient, showing down here a point spread function, or what a point of light would look like for total aberrations, both low and high order. Now we can separate just the high order, and we see that vertical deformation, which this is very common, vertical coma, a real common high order aberration in keratoconus, as we can isolate here in showing you in that particular patient. So utilizing aberrometry, we can get a real idea of what happens to the patient's vision, not only due to their keratoconus and what we can expect from glasses, but we also can see, interestingly enough, I don't have a slide here for you tonight, but we can see the effect on high order aberrations by placing contact lenses on, doing pre and post contact lens aberrometry. So let's kind of do a little summary on early detection of keratoconus and other forms of corneal ectasia. Number one, they're critically important in light of technologies that can halt progression, specifically corneal cross-linking. It has become incumbent upon us to make earliest diagnosis possible, detection of progression as soon as possible, and intervene for those patients who either show progression definitively or are at high risk for progression. The detection methods and technologies, yeah, we have low tech and we all use them in our practice. Listen, a good history and the symptoms, a very careful refraction, looking at differences between the two eyes that are not typical, especially in the astigmatic element. Yes, if we don't have other systems, looking at keratometric findings, and a very careful slit lamp. High tech, we talked about tonight, utilizing Placido topography that a significant percentage of us have in our practices, but moving on to corneal tomography, anterior segment OCT, corneal biomechanics, and aberrometry. So I want to thank you, and I'm thanking you also for Dr. Tullo for your attention this evening. The next webinar, September 7th, will be talking about now what do we do about this disease. We know about it from the first seminar and webinar we gave. We know how to detect it, and we know how to look for progression from tonight, but now what can we do about it, both from visual rehabilitation and control of progression? Optical, medical, and surgical treatments for keratoconus. That's next week. It's going to be amazing. Doctors Chang and Morgenstern will give that talk. So right now I'm going to hand things back over to Chris to finalize things for tonight, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eiden. Thank you very much, Dr. Tullo. Very exciting lectures, very interesting. Give me 1 second here, and I'm going to actually just post some information for everybody that's on the webinar tonight. So just in case you missed the last webinar in this three-part series, or if you're interested in watching any other lectures that we have recorded, you can go to our website, www.oculususa.com, and we have a webcast section on there. You can go and see all the recordings. We usually have them posted about a week to 2 weeks after the live webinar. We also have some live lectures that we have a separate website for, and that's www.oculustv.com. And then I have some information on here for current Oculus customers. If you have any service needs, you can contact our service department. And then if you have any questions regarding the products Dr. Eiden mentioned tonight, Dr. Tullo mentioned tonight, or just any general questions for Oculus, you can always contact us at sales@oculususa.com or call the 1-800 number that's listed here on the screen. So again, thank you, Dr. Eiden and Dr. Tullo, for your lectures. If anybody has any questions, again, you can go ahead and type those questions on the right side of your screen here. Dr. Eiden, Dr. Tullo, do we have time for just a couple questions here?
Absolutely.
Right here, sure.
Excellent. So I'll start with the first one here. Is it possible to use the thickness display on the Pentacam to predict the risk of corneal high drops?
To predict the risk for developing corneal high drops, from my perspective, I wouldn't say that it has a definitive predictive value. I haven't found that to be the most useful aspect of that. The most important element is looking for anomalies in the detection of the disease, the early detection of the disease. And again, the PTI being an amazingly sensitive element, especially if you add that to all of the factors used in the Belin-Ambrosio display, but not specific. Bill, I don't know your comment on that.
I have a comment similar to you. The one thing I would add is that the key value, especially now with the progressive keratoconus metrics given by Dr. Bell in the ABCD format, you can watch corneas as they do progress, and I think understanding the progression will give you a better sense if they are at risk of going to the ultimate end stage of the disease.
Chris, is that the end of our questions?
We lost connection on the last hour.
Oh, I apologize. So next question here. Does this knowledge change how we fit scleral lenses, since most lenses are fit on the steep K values?
Oh, that's a great question. So K values are becoming less and less important, especially in fitting contact lenses. We're really starting to realize that fitting contact lenses is all about sagittal height. So we look at the sagittal height and sagittal shape of the cornea, and we want to match that with the lenses that we fit. All contact lenses are fit sagittally. So because we had such limited data for so many decades with keratometry, that's the only thing we had to do. But to be honest with you, we're now going to be able to predict the best fit lens based on these shape factors. And I can tell you there's work being done even through the Pentacam system right now. It's not available, but I've had a chance, fortunately, to see some of this developing software where the system's going to be able to measure corneoscleral profiles 360 degrees around the surface of the eye, and that data can be used to actually construct a scleral contact lens. Anterior segment OCT has been used by some individuals similarly to construct scleral lenses. So the dependence on quote-unquote K values is becoming less and less.
Thank you, Dr. Eiden. So you mentioned false positive keratoconus on topography. How often do you come across this in clinical practice?
Bill, I'm going to let you respond to that, because one of the most important areas is in determination if one is a refractive surgical candidate. In Bill's role with TLC, this has been a huge issue. So I'm going to let you grab that one. Bill, are you there?
Dr. Tullo?
Oh, maybe he isn't there, so I'll grab it. Okay. So we do come across it. I mean, I see cases very, very often that are actually even referred to our practice for keratoconus management, and we end up realizing they're not actually keratoconus. And I will tell you, there are no happier patients than those patients who come to us thinking they have keratoconus, and we realize that through technologies like Pentacam, we can tell them with no lack of certainty that they don't have keratoconus. So we see all forms. You'll see those that appear to look keratoconic on Placido topography due to the reasons that Dr. Tullo mentioned, the line of sight issues, the angle kappa issues, poor alignment by the technician, or even just simple decentered steep points on a normal cornea. And the elevation maps are absolutely normal, and the global pachymetry maps are absolutely normal. So those are wonderful, but we also have patients that we miss. And those are the patients, especially, that's why I asked Dr. Tullo to address it, who would be interested perhaps in having LASIK surgery, and you do a Placido topography, they look absolutely fine. And you say, well, that's great. You know, your myopia is appropriate for this, your age, you know, we use an ultrasound thickness measurement of the cornea, and you're okay with that. Well, we run a Pentacam, and then we see that they have a posterior surface anomaly in terms of elevation. They may have, in addition to that, a pachymetric progression anomaly. We'll see through the Belin-Ambrosio display that a number of those D values, and maybe the total D value, is either borderline or abnormal. And I can tell you at our practice, when we come across those patients, we absolutely will not treat them.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Eiden. I see Dr. Tullo is still on, but I guess maybe he's lost audio here. So I think I'm just going to take one more question here, and then we'll call it a night. And then we do have the other webinar next week, as you mentioned, on Wednesday, September 7th at the same time. For more questions, also anybody can always email us, and then we can forward those emails along. But last question here, you showed several elevation maps. At what point does posterior elevation and anterior elevation concern you?
Yeah, excellent point. And actually, it's going to be system specific. So what I'm going to tell you now is relating to Pentacam. And, you know, of course, normative data-based studies have been done. Excuse me. And basically, I'm going to give you general numbers. At the most anteriorly displaced point, or quote-unquote the apex of your suspected cone, on the front surface of the cornea, any numbers that are over 8 microns above the reference sphere at that location start to get me concerned. You know, above 10, 12, definitively concerned on the anterior. On the posterior, typically, depending again about the refractive error, because the numbers now really relate to myopia, which is the more common situation. Anything that's getting to the 13, 14, 15 microns above the reference sphere and greater is where I start to get concerned. But those numbers go up higher for hyperopes. And again, if you have the system in your practice and you're wondering about that, you use the Belin-Ambrosio ectasia display, because that incorporates all the statistical analysis as well. So I hope that answered the question properly.
I think so. Again, thank you, Dr. Eiden. Thank both of you, doctors. And again, thank you everybody else for joining, and we'll be back next week on Wednesday, September 7th, 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Pacific time. So,
thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.